Shabbat Shalom. I hope everyone's blessed and having a wonderful Hanukkah. By the time you see this, I will be in Spain visiting my in-laws, so I'm actually pre-recording this Torah portion. And this one is another really, really exciting one in terms of interesting things that I found that I just have never seen before. We're continuing with the story of Joseph, which, as I explained last week, is one of my favorite stories in Scripture. And the Torah portion is called Mikkets, and it's from Genesis 41:1 through 44:17. And it begins with Pharaoh having these dreams, which, as we find out, are the prophecy of the famine that's coming. And one thing that kind of caught my eye that I guess hadn't really caught my eye before was when he has the dreams about the cows, fat ones and the thin ones, they're coming up out of the Nile. And I thought, oh, well, I know Rico Cortez has taught a pretty in-depth teaching about this, about the water judgment and going through the waters, and those who make it through the waters are blessed by the gods. Like, this was a belief the Egyptians had, and that's why it's so significant that Moshe came out of the water, as well as the Israelites, when they escaped Egypt, they crossed the water, they crossed on dry land, but the waters came back and buried the Egyptians. So they had the judgment of the waters. And so I thought, well, maybe this is another thing. Maybe it's significant in that sense. Maybe it has something to do with that because the cows are coming out of the water. But then you read on, and actually the corn doesn't. And so the second dream is the corn. You have the fat ears and the thin ears. And so maybe the difference is because one is a living animal and the other is a plant. Maybe there's something else going on there. I don't know, but I wanted to bring it up in case anybody had some insight on that they wanted to share. Now, when Joseph comes to interpret the dream for Pharaoh, this is because finally he was remembered. If you remember last week, he had interpreted the dreams for Pharaoh's two servants, the baker and the cupbearer. And the one that had the favorable interpretation, Joseph asked him to remember him and remind Pharaoh about him, and he forgot until Pharaoh had this dream. He's like, oh, wait, I remember this guy, Joseph. And so Joseph's called from prison, and he's placed before Pharaoh. And he says something very interesting in Genesis 41, verse 16. And this is in response to Pharaoh, where essentially Pharaoh says you can interpret the dream, and he says, not I. God will see to Pharaoh's welfare. And so on the surface, I for a long time have just thought, well, yeah, he's giving God the glory. He doesn't interpret these dreams without God's help, without his spirit. But the thing that was weird to me this time was that he said, God will see to Pharaoh's welfare. And I'm thinking, well, famine isn't exactly welfare. And yes, through this interpretation, Joseph helps Egypt make it through the famine, and actually Pharaoh gains a lot of riches through this. But it just seemed weird at first, so I looked up the meaning of the Hebrew words here, and there's something very interesting. I'm using, if you remember, the JPS Hebrew English Tanakh, and the phrase there is God will see to Pharaoh's welfare. In the King James Version, what it actually says is God will give an answer of peace. And there are actually two Hebrew words here. The first is anah, and the second is shalom, which we're all familiar with. So anah means answer, respond, testify, give account. And shalom is completeness, soundness, peace. And so I think it's a bit deeper than just seeing to Pharaoh's welfare. I think what's happening is he's giving Pharaoh an answer of something that's complete. And in this case, it's the prophecy. If you go down a little bit further to verse 32, it says, as for Pharaoh having had the same dream twice, it means that the matter has been determined by God and that God will soon carry it out. So essentially what God is doing here is he's sending Pharaoh a message of completeness, soundness. I don't think it's peace here, maybe, because like I said, Pharaoh does end up coming out pretty good at the end of this. But I think it's deeper than that. It's more like he's giving him this account. It's full, it's complete, it's sealed, it's a done deal. And again, bringing up the two witnesses. We see it here. The dream is had twice. It even says in verse 28 means that God has decided the matter. He showed Pharaoh what he's about to do. So you have that whole theme of the two witnesses. Now, we talked a little bit last week about Joseph and the things that happen in Joseph's life, often being a mirror or a prophecy of Messiah. And I found a couple more examples in this portion this week. So let's move to verse 45. We're still in chapter 41. This is after Joseph tells him what should be done to help make sure Egypt makes it through the famine. Pharaoh appoints him to do this. He's head of essentially the whole country, and he gives him a wife. And the wife, he also gives him a name, a new name. Joseph gets a new name. We've talked about names before in previous Torah portions, and the name he gives him is Zaphanath-Paneah. And I have a little footnote here in my scripture, and it says, Egyptian for God speaks. He lives, or creator of life, which makes sense because God was essentially speaking through Joseph because he gave him the interpretation of the dream. But I wanted to see what the meaning was in Hebrew, so I looked it up. It's like a transliteration, so it sounds exactly the same. Zaphanath-Paneah, just spelled in Hebrew. And it's very, very interesting what it means. It means treasury of the glorious rest. Wow. So that's super cool to me because we know that Yeshua ultimately is our rest. He's our Sabbath. At the end of days, we'll fulfill that and we'll have glorious rest through him. And a treasury is like a treasure trove, right? The source of everything. And so right here in the name that Pharaoh gives Joseph, as he's about to essentially bring salvation to Egypt, and also bring salvation to his brothers, because they come up out of Canaan to Egypt to get rations. This is the name that he gets. And so just like Yeshua, who is our glorious rest, he saves his brothers through salvation. And so I found that very, very interesting and very cool. Now, the other thing that comes out of this is that the scripture states that Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh. Yeshua was 30 when he started his ministry. And so as Joseph enters the service of Pharaoh, the beginning of his journey to bring salvation to his brothers, it's the same age as when Yeshua enters the service of his father, when he starts his ministry and his journey towards the salvation of his brothers. So really, really interesting. Analogy is not the right word, but mirror images and kind of prophecies and foreshadows of Messiah right here in the story of Joseph. Now, the other thing that we see happening is more dreams coming true. Now, in previous portions, with Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker and Pharaoh himself, it seemed like the dreams came true pretty quickly after Joseph interpreted them. But the dreams that hadn't come true quickly were his own, about his brothers bowing down to him. If you remember, last week's Torah portion started with that. That's why they hated him. But in this portion, they bowed down to him 3 times. So the first time is in verse 6 of chapter 42. When the first time they come to him, they're bowing down to him. And so we're finally seeing that prophecy fulfilled, and it's being fulfilled over and over and over again. Now, if you remember last week, Reuben he's the firstborn, and he also was the one who was trying to save Joseph and restore him to his father when the rest of the brothers wanted to kill him and pretend that he'd been eaten by a beast or whatever. So what's happening now is, as it comes out, Joseph's accusing his brothers of being spies. He wants to see his younger brother Benjamin, and he's saying, I'm going to keep one of you. The rest of you are going to come back with your younger brother, or else I'm not releasing your brother, the one I take, to you. And what's really interesting, let's see, verse 22. So I just got to find this. Okay, so what's happening is after Joseph says this, the brothers are really upset, and they feel like, oh, no, we're being punished for what we did to Joseph all those years ago. They're speaking to one another in Hebrew. And once again, as with Joseph, Reuben is the one speaking up. He says, then Reuben spoke up and said to them, did I not tell you? Do no wrong to the boy. But you paid no heed. Now comes the reckoning for his blood. Well, Joseph understands everything. And at this point, it says he's actually turning away from them and weeping. Now, what's very interesting is when he turns back, the brother that he chooses to take is not the firstborn, Reuben. It's actually the secondborn, Simeon. And as I'm reading through this, I'm like, okay, I write down on my notes, could this be because he heard what Reuben said? And he said, okay, Reuben actually tried to save my life. So even though, and I'm not sure if this is customary or not, but I'm assuming that it would have been customary to take the firstborn. And so maybe Joseph's thought process is, even though it would be more normal for me to take the firstborn, maybe I will take the secondborn because I'm essentially having mercy on Reuben because he tried to save me. And then I'm like, okay, I'm going to look up Simeon's name just to see. And it means heard. I was like, okay, how can you have a quicker, more emphatic, obvious yes answer to what you were wondering? Because my question was, is it because you heard what Reuben said? And here we go. The meaning of Simeon's name is heard. So I found that, wow, mind-blowing. That was so amazing. And I just love it when these little things happen to me when I'm studying scripture. And so the last thing I want to mention is just all these little clues that Joseph is kind of throwing out there to his brother, that he knows them. And not only does he know them, but that he is their brother. And the first one is in chapter 42, verse 18, when he says, on the third day, Joseph said to them, do this and you shall live, for I am a God-fearing man. And just think about this for a minute. He looks just like an Egyptian. He's dressed like one. He's the head of the land of Egypt. Egyptians don't exactly serve Yahweh. And so he's throwing out the first clue here. I am a God-fearing man. He's indicating that he serves the God of the Hebrews. Why would an Egyptian do that? That should have struck them as a little weird, at least in my opinion. Taking Simeon also, I think there's a clue there. Like if they had been thinking about, well, Simeon's name means heard, maybe they would have understood, oh, he heard us and he understood us and he knows what we're saying. So there's another clue there. Of course he knew they were never going to figure that out. It's one of those things that you see after the fact and you're like, oh, of course. And obviously God was putting this together and he was so much wiser than we were. And now that we see all the little pieces, it's so obvious and so amazing and so beautiful. The next clue is in chapter 43, verse 33, where it says, they were seated by his direction from the oldest in order of his seniority to the youngest in the order of his youth. And this is probably the most obvious clue, and this is the one that they actually notice, because it says they looked at one another in astonishment. And of course, he's giving Benjamin the double portion of the food, and etc., which should be a clue. Because Joseph and Benjamin were both the children of Rachel, the most loved wife, so they were the true full brothers to one another. And now the final clue, which I think ties it all the way back to the beginning of the story of Joseph, is in chapter 44, verse 15, where it says, and this is after he put his cup in Benjamin's bag and sent the men after to chase his brothers and bring them back. And he's saying, what is this deed that you have done? Did you not know that a man like me practices divination? And if his brothers had just thought about it for a second, why did they hate their brother Joseph? Because he kept having dreams, and he kept interpreting them for them. And the interpretation, they didn't like it, because it meant that they're bowing down to him. And what's happening this final time, when they come back, they're scared because they know what's going to happen to Joseph if they don't bring Benjamin back. So they actually throw themselves at Joseph's feet. And then he says, don't you know that I practice divination? And it's like, see, the prophecy is coming true. My dreams about you were that you would bow down to me. Remember? And so he's not out and out stating it to him, but he's throwing these little clues out. And once you know the story from the beginning to the end, you can see it as it's happening to them. Of course, they don't get it. But I just found that really interesting, and I love those clever clues like that. Whether it's a book that I'm reading or a movie I'm watching, it just makes the story really rich. And it, in the case of Scripture, really helps me to praise our Father for His amazing wisdom. Um, these type of things, you have people that argue about, well, Scripture was written by men, blah blah blah. No, these types of things, no man could have really thought that up, because it doesn't happen just in one book. You'll see it happen across the whole Scripture, where some clue that happens in Genesis, you see something related to it in the book of Job, or some other book. And so there's just no way, I believe, that a single man that wasn't inspired by Yahweh could have written Scripture, and these types of things are the evidence for that. So I hope you've enjoyed this portion. Enjoy the rest of the Hanukkah holiday, and Shabbat Shalom.